Hello everyone. So yes, this is a talk about Aloha and trying to find if we can say new things about Aloha because it's been a long time. And with classical roadmap for the talk, a bit of theory, a bit of practice, and yeah, we'll see from that. But to start with, reminder or maybe explanation for those who didn't that before. What's Aloha and what's adaptive Aloha? So imagine you've got a channel of communication and you can occupy it by speaking, try to occupy it or not. If you're alone, like you just have Alice that speaks, it's a win. There is a transmission of information of a packet. If you just have Bob, and if he's the only one to occupy the channel, it's a success as well. There is transmission of packet. But if Alice and Bob try to speak sort of at the same time, it will be a cacophony and you will have no transmission at all. It's a collision. And the principle of adaptive Aloha is just to say, okay, if you have a collision, you should try to speak less often, give more room to others. But if you don't see any collision, if you succeed in transmission, you can try to speak more often. Very simple. And there is many models for Aloha. I will just give you one of the main classical ones. So you imagine that your times is separated into slots, and you've got a certain number of stations and stations, each one with its own arrival process of packets. Choose whatever you want. We don't care. And you've got this notion of contention window. And basically, whenever you have something to transmit, what you do is you wait a bit. You wait a certain amount of slots determined by your current contention window. And in case of collision, you typically double the size of your window up to a maximal window size Cmax. But if you can transmit, then you can reduce your contention window to a minimal size. And here we didn't use exactly this model. We made a few slight modifications. First one, we don't care about the specificities of the actual arrival process of packets. So we consider a kind of worst case scenario with all stations being what we call chatty. That is, they want to speak every time. They've got a full bunch of packets to transmit. So blah, 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 blah. They want to speak, they want to speak, they want to speak. So it's really a worst case. Imagine that at some point in your network, everyone wants to speak, has something to say. So yeah, because we don't want to study the specificities of the arrival process of packets. And instead of contention window, we use a notion of emission probability, where at each slot, you decide to transmit or not with a probability P0 alpha to the power of C. We do that because when you've got a contention window, you need to take into account the current window size and which values inside the window you choose. So two parameters, larger state of space to consider. And it's much simpler and almost equivalent to assume that at each time you decide if you transmit or not. So the equivalent of doubling the window consists in adding 1 to your parameter C. And the equivalent of having a success and resetting your window is setting C to 0. So far, so good? Great. So our goal, precisely, is to try to understand what happens when N is big. Do we have a huge cacophony where everyone tries to speak and basically nothing happens? It's just collisions, no transmission. Or do we have a kind of self-organizations where some good put that happens? So what did we achieve in terms of theoretical results? To do that, I will make a brief reminder. So very, very simple, very basic for those that knows a bit about queuing theory, about the MM1 queue. So you've got this queue, okay, with arrival rate lambda, departure rate mu, and the load lambda over mu. And what's the first thing you want to do when you have this type of things, when you're doing queues? Okay, I've got an infinity of states. Are we stable? It's kind of a Pavlov reflex when you're from Q, it's the first question you ask, are we stable? So in the case of MMU, it's very simple. If the load is less than 1, you're stable and you are happy. If it's more than 1, you're not happy because it's unstable and the size of the Q grows to infinity. But what about Aloha stability with the specification I gave earlier? Well, stable, it just means that the parameters C, that you can interpret as waiting times between transmission of packets, are relatively contained. And unstable means that you have, at least from some part of the system, some waiting times that can go to infinity. But is it really important? Is it really, are you really happy when you're stable? Are you really unhappy when you're unstable? At least for me, it's not clear. And it's one of the things we want to consider. Okay, but still think about stability and try to think of a simple condition for instability. So remember the model. You've got for each station an emission probability P0 alpha to the power of C. You increase C by 1 if you have a collision. You decrease C to 0 if you have a transmission. So can you think of a simple condition that ensures that the system will not be stable? Come on. What? P0 equal to 1? Yes. Yes, it's simple and it's sufficient. I grant you that. Can you do a bit better? What? If alpha is big, oh, that's debatable. That's debatable. So simple condition is just to have P0 greater or equal to alpha. Surprising, but it's vast, but it's like this. And how is that? I will not give you a full proof, but I will just give you the intuition. So consider just 2 stations, Alice and Bob, and imagine that the state of Alice is a large C and the state of Bob is 0. And try to see how you can go from state C0 to state C plus 1, 0. So there are possibly multiple paths, but we just consider this path. At some point, Alice and Bob speak together. So it happens with probability P2, P02, alpha to the power of C. Then you reach C plus 1, 1. And as long as none of them speaks, you stay in the state. Then at some point, Bob speaks, not Alice. You reach C plus 1, 0. And then as long as Alice does not speak, you will stay in that state. Okay, so you've got this path. And so this is exact. And if C is large, you can approximate the different value with this. And if you do the computation, it gives you the relationships that probability of having C plus 1, 0 is up to approximation greater of or equal to P of C0 times this. So I just basically add all the parameters there, which is P0 over alpha. And back to MM1, if this is greater than 1, you're in trouble because the probability will increase with the state. But if it's less than 1, it's okay. But you can't say anything because it's an inequality there. But at least you know that if P0 is greater than 1, that alpha, sorry, you will have troubles. Okay? Can we do something more subtle, more accurate? So to do that, I will introduce a value that we call B, which is a probability that the channel is occupied with transmission or collision, I don't care, for the state with n-1 stations instead of n. So this can be computed in theory, especially if the system is stable. It's not as very clear if it's unstable, but in practice, it can be also estimated if the system is unstable. So you've got this parameter B. What's the necessary and sufficient condition to be stable for n stations? No, no one. B smaller than alpha. So I'll just give you the intuition. It's actually much simpler to explain the intuition. Imagine one station, say Alice, and imagine the transition from her state C to the state C plus 1. It happens basically if she speaks and some other person speaks at the same time, or many persons speak at the same time, which happens with probability B, if there is independence between Alice and the rest of the world. So actually, the very trick of the proof is to be able to write this. And I will not detail here how you do that. But we can, thanks to Richard. And then when Alice is in state C plus 1, she stays there as long as she doesn't speak. Whenever she speaks, she will either go back to 0 or increase by 1. And same as before, you can deduce an equation from there, which is P C plus 1 is approximately P over alpha P of C. So same again. If B is greater than alpha, you're in trouble. If it's smaller, it should be good. And here, this is not an inequality as before. It's an equality. So we're good. So case solved, I guess, because to compute the stability, you just have to kind of recursively decide what happens if you have one less station and just check if the noise that you get is smaller than alpha. Okay, so we can go back to sleep. But then here I am, and I try to do simulations to kind of prove all these things. So I made a small simulator, and to take into account the different time scales, I divide my simulations into epochs. Basically, epoch t corresponds to what happens around 2 to the power of t slots, after 2 to the power of t slots, roughly. So t equals 0, imagine it's 1 millisecond, and yes, t equal to 10, 1 second, 20, quarter of an hour, 30, 10 days, that's a long time, 40, 30 years. Yeah, power of 2 can be trouble sometimes. And now it's time for a pop quiz. So I've given you this curve made from simulation that tells you, depending on the epoch you choose, what the state distribution observed. So if you see this type of curve, are you stable? Are you not stable? Yeah, you're stable. But you already saw the presentation at Algotel, so yeah. You're stable. So basically, here you have a parameter, 4 stations, 1/8 for P0, 1/2 for alpha. And basically, whenever you see a decreasing slope, think MM1, yeah, it's always less likely to have a bigger state than the previous state. So it's kind of a strong indicator of stability. Let's continue. If you see this, stable, not stable. You say stable? Unstable. So yeah, I could say, oh, I can see that it's kind of increasing, but actually you just need to look at the parameters, which I didn't show you, of course, 1/2, 1/2, and I know that the system cannot be stable. Ah, this one. Should be ready now. What? Does it look like something decreasing? Yeah, but I will come to that later. What happens there? So yeah, it's unstable. Then again, I just need to look at the parameters that I didn't show you. I use 1 over 2, 1 over 2. P0 equal to alpha means instability. Last but not least, this is not the same curve as before. So the parameters are there, 1,000 stations and P0 smaller than alpha. And the answer, at least as far as I'm concerned, is I have not the slightest idea if this is stable or not. I don't know. I don't know. And actually, what's the issue there? And something that was maybe forgotten in terms of theory. It's, you know, each time you want to increment C by 1, you need to wait twice the time that the step before. So having C equal 20, for instance, means to wait a quarter of an hour. Having C equals 30 means to wait, I don't know, 10 days. I don't remember the values, but you see the thing. It takes very, very, very long. And in particular, so I will answer to you, Ludovic. What you see there is just, you know, the front of the progression of the simulation. It goes down because you cannot have physically the time to reach the states. So this is what you see, the progression of the convergence of the simulation. And you cannot make the difference, it's really impossible, between a stable state where you have positive non-negligible values of C greater than T and unstable state. You will not be able to see what the difference. And I like this proverb. If you have no solution, maybe it's you have no problem. So we started the study about stability, but actually our conclusion is maybe we don't actually care if it's stable or not. But then what should we care about? We should care about, okay, what's the performance of the system? And for instance, we can study with simulation, what's the actual occupation of a channel, the parameter B with time, and what's the good put, the number of packets that you actually, the proportion of packets that you actually manage to transmit. No, the good put is the proportion of the time of a channel where you have an actual transmission. It's better. And what you see, it's actually after, even with 1,000 stations, after a couple of seconds, you start to have convergence. So at start, it's a huge cacophony. Everyone speaks at the same time. No one managed to transmit. But wait a few epochs, say 10 seconds or such, and you will already have, yeah, almost what you should have asymptotically in terms of good put that is achieved. So we have a channel that is used, but the question is how it is used exactly. Do all the stations have the same bit rate always, which will be very small, just because you divide by n? Or do we have a skewed distribution with a few stations having a big enough transmission rate and all others having almost nothing? And to do that, we measured what is the number of stations that have a reasonable parameter C, say C less than 4. That means that can speak relatively fast enough. And because we have a good put, they can have a good enough transmission rate. And what we see there is that this number of stations that can speak, it doesn't go down with the number of stations, but actually it managed to keep it up and to reach kind of asymptotic value. And of course, it evolved with the epoch. But as you see, even if you consider epoch of about 1 hour, even if you have a lot of stations, like 1,000, you manage to have a few stations that can speak, that will be able to speak. So this is what we call the implicit admission control, because you can have a bunch of stations, And automatically, the system will select a few of them to be able to speak, while the others will be frozen. Of course, these stations will change with time. Some stations that are frozen sometimes will get unfrozen, and so there will be a cycle. But at each given moment, you've got a few stations that have a decent rate. And this, I'm almost finished, make me go back to how Aloha is currently working. Currently, Aloha has a bounded value of C. You cannot go arbitrarily large. So that means if you have many, many stations and they want to speak a lot, basically they will all reach the maximal quotation window and they will all speak at the same time, and it will be all cacophony and all collisions. But with our model, where we just remove this assumption that you have a cap, a maximal value to the quotation window, then you have an automatic freeze of some stations, of actually a large part of stations, to allow a few stations to have a decent rate. So yeah, this is the end of the talk. So takeaway is we have a nice stability results, but we actually realize that stability may not be what we want to study with this model. And actually we want to have a kind of a study of pseudo stability and convergence of the performance, which happens at faster scale than the actual convergence or unconvergence of the system. And we showed with simulation, and we try to prove it more rigorously right now, that you have a skew distribution of station rate that allows to have an implicit ambition control. Full version is not available yet, but it's in progress. Thank you very much for your attention. Yeah.
So in your system, effectively, some base stations, let's say, are kicked out, right? They can never participate when the contention window goes to a very large value, right?
Yeah, exactly. We call them frozen because of the chance, the probability that they have to speak becomes arbitrarily low. Yes.
So, I mean, in a practical system, this won't be good, right? I mean, people would want to participate.
Well, you know, in practice, what you do is external admission control. That is, you don't freeze the stations, you just don't allow them to come into the system.
Okay,
so,
I see. So, like, but are you thinking of some provision of letting the frozen users re-allowed after some while, or they are never going to be like allowed in the transmission again?
It's not never. It's with very, very low probability. So
practical purposes, it's never allowed, right? It's like
no, in practice, one question that can be asked is if we can have distinguish value of pairs, like having pairs that are allowed not to be frozen and pairs that can be frozen. Actually, you can do that by tweaking the parameters P0 alpha for different stations. But yeah, the frozen part for us, it's kind of mandatory if you want to keep the system alive.
I see.
So you need to freeze the station for the system not to be frozen.
So it's a feature, it's not a bug. I see. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, you had these equations where you had some sort of independence property. I was wondering, so this independence between stations only holds in the limit. So are these like mean field representation of the system, and how does this independence impact the assumption, impact the analysis of stability condition for finite n?
Okay, so actually there is multiple tricks here. Well, you know that I'm a big fan of mean field approach, and I'll be totally transparent. If you go mean field recklessly, you will have completely absurd results. Like if you try to compute full mean field equations of a system, it works, you write nice things. But for instance, you will find out that the system is stable even if P0 is greater than alpha. And we know that it's not the case. So actually, the independence hypothesis is completely out of question. You cannot say that because the fact that you speak means that the other are relatively more frozen, but if you cannot speak. And yeah, this is actually a big win by Richard to be able, in this specific case, to be able to write this. And if you try to do this out of the blue for every question using mean field and independence, you will say silly things relatively fast. We'll have relatively nice equations if P0 is smaller than alpha, but you will have the same equation if P0 is greater than alpha, wherever you know that it should not be that.
But this product form is also an independence property, right? But you say it's not the mean field one; it's something else. That's
yeah. I don't remind the 2 pages of the proof of Richard of how we was able to kind of upper and lower bound this to be able to write that. But yeah, so the case where you can assume pseudo independence are very difficult. But to bounce back, you told about the number of values of stations. This is actually not so much the issue. It's more really the convergence time. I cannot tell you how much accurate it is because I cannot measure up to the convergence. For instance, in, where is it? The last one, yeah. So basically basically to be stable, the blue curve should go below 1/2. And I've never be able to go as far as I want. I computed the age of the universe in terms of number of slots will not be enough to determine with this value if I'm good enough. Well, yeah.